Hello and welcome to our presentation this evening, Empowered, the History of Muncie Women's Suffrage. This is a community collaboration between the Ball State University Libraries, Delaware County Historical Society, Minnetrista, and the Muncie Public Library. This presentation is also sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Muncie and Delaware County. Also, we will be recording this presentation and make it available through the Ball State University Digital Media Repository. So first things first, we have some housekeeping rules. You are free to have your video on, but given the number of participants this evening, it would help with the bandwidth for videos to be turned off. For the time being, we have muted everyone. There will be time for questions between each segment and at the end of the presentation. If you wish to ask a question, you can use the chat box. The button to access the chat is located in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. When using the chat box, please make sure that the To field is labeled To Everyone. This way, all participants can see the question. If you wish to ask your question verbally, we will ask that you raise your hand. This function is also in the toolbar under the Participants button. If you click Participants, a box will pop up with a list of names. To raise your hand, please click the blue Raised Hand button, and I will unmute you so you can ask your question. Right now, I'm going to ask for everyone who is able to enter into the chat box so they can hear us and see our presentation slides. All right. So let's get started with some introductions this evening. I am Sara, Allison, Head of Archives User Engagement at the Ball State University Libraries, Archives, and Special Collections, and will be your moderator. This evening, we will be hearing from Karen Brown-Good, who is the Interim Director of the Delaware County Historical Society and a founding member of the Notable Women of Muncie and Delaware County Committee. Melissa Gentry, who is the Supervisor in the GIS Research and Map Collection at Ball State University Libraries and a founding member of the Notable Women of Muncie and Delaware County Committee. Jessica Jenkins is the Vice President of Collections and Storytelling at Minnetrista, author of Exploring Women's Suffrage Through 50 Historical Treasures, and also a founding member of the Notable Women's Project Committee. Sara McKinley is the Local History and Genealogy Supervisor at Muncie Public Library and manager of the Carnegie Library. And Karen Vincent is the Delaware County Historian, president of the Delaware County Historical Society, and also a founding member of the Notable Women's Project Committee. Let's give them all a virtual round of applause. As I mentioned, this evening's presentation is sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Muncie and Delaware County. To get us started, I have a message to share from Linda Hansen, spokesperson for the League of Women Voters of Muncie and Delaware County and the co-president of the League of Women Voters of Indiana. Indiana women had a predominant place in the birthday of the League of Women Voters. COVID restrictions scuttled many of our plans to celebrate our centennial in 2020, but that reminded us of the suffragists who pressed on through the flu epidemic of 1918 to secure passage of the 19th Amendment. We had to adapt. The League's efforts to ensure every person has safe, secure, unrestricted access to the ballot box has not been abated. If anything, they have been expanded. Those who would limit voting access in order to gain or maintain political power have presented a consistent challenge over the last century. The League's driving goal is to make democracy work for all of us. So before we move on to our presenters this evening, I thought we would take a quick look at some women of Muncie and Delaware County who were appointed, elected, and held political and public office since the ratification of the 19th Amendment. In 1917, elected Chase Murphy was the the first female deputy prosecutor in the United States. And I know this is 3 years before the ratification, but I wanted to include her, and in the 1940s, she served as Center Township's Justice of the Peace. Julia Nelson was the first woman elected to the Indiana State Legislature the same year the 19th Amendment was ratified to represent Delaware County. The Muncie Evening Press described election night as follows, quote, "The headquarters were packed, as well as the hall outside. Finally, the completed returns from Precinct 26 were telephoned from the poll, giving Miss Nelson a total of 431 votes. A rousing cheer went up for Indiana's first woman legislature. While the crowd cried for a speech, Miss Nelson said, 'I am thankful for the honor that has been conferred upon me, but more, I am happy at this great triumph for America.'" Margaret Harrison was the first woman to serve as the local chair of the Delaware County Democratic Party in 1920. Betty Shelton Cole was Muncie's first judge. She was appointed to fill a seat in May of 1980 and won in November of that year. Mary Alice Cherry was appointed Muncie's first deputy mayor in August of 1987. In 2004, Joanne Gora became the first female president of Ball State University and served in that role until her retirement in 2014. In July of 2018, Susanna Rivera Mills became the first female provost and executive vice president of Ball State University. In 2008, Sharon McShirley was Muncie's 32nd mayor and the first female to hold that office. She previously served in the office of the provost and vice president of academic affairs at Ball State, and as mayor, some of her accomplishments included strategic planning with respect to city parks, work with Prairie Creek Reservoir and Tui Pool, and infrastructure improvements in terms of pavement and sidewalks. These few women are a small portion of the many women who have participated in political and public office since the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Now grab your votes for Women's Sash and get ready to feel empowered by women's organizations and individuals who contributed to the suffrage movement in Muncie and Delaware County. Our first presenter this evening will be Karen Vincent.
Thank you. I became acquainted with Elizabeth Claypool Earle while doing research on the history of Delaware County Historical Society. And in the 1920s, Indiana Historical Society urged all Indiana counties that had not already done so to form a historical society. So next slide, please. And according to an announcement in the Muncie Morning Star, Mrs. Earle acted as an agent of the state society and as temporary chair of the local society. She also presided at the organizational meeting of Delaware County Historical Society, where her brother, Frank Claypool, was elected the first president. Since she sounded interesting, I wanted to learn more about her. And the first thing I did was to read a brief but excellent biography that Karen Good wrote, which is available on the Delaware County Historical Society website. So next slide, please. Elizabeth Claypool was born to Hannah Ann Patty and Austin Bingley Claypool on June 25th, 1856, in Indiana somewhere. Places mentioned in different accounts of her life include Huntersville, Connorsville, and Cambridge City. Wherever she was born, she did spend her childhood and some of her adult life in and around Connorsville. She had several siblings who died in infancy and 3 who lived to adulthood, all accomplished people in their own right. Her sister, Virginia Claypool Meredith, known as the Queen of American Agriculture, was the first woman trustee at Purdue University. Her brother, Frank, was a well-known farmer, a realtor, and part owner of the Muncie Morning News. And Marcus was a banker, farmer, and one-time president of the Indiana State Board of Agriculture. The Claypool family owned approximately 400 acres of land east of Muncie. The former Claypool Elementary School, named for Marcus Claypool, is located on that land. Next slide, please. Elizabeth's early education was in private schools. After graduating high school, she attended Glendale Female College in Cincinnati. In 1878, Elizabeth married Morrell J. Earl of Lafayette, junior partner of the wholesale firm A. Earl and Company. Unfortunately, less than a year after she and Morrell were married, he died of typhoid pneumonia at age 26. Elizabeth returned to Connorsville to make her home with her parents and became involved in a number of local, state, and national activities, including the Women's Franchise League and the League of Women Voters. Her father died in 1906 and her mother in 1913. And sometime after that time, Elizabeth moved to Muncie, where her brothers already lived. Next slide, please. Libraries and literacy were always a special interest, and Elizabeth was active with the State Library Commission and with legislation relating to Indiana libraries. In 1898, she served on a committee of 3 from the State Union of Literacy Clubs. This committee lobbied for a bill which would reform library laws. At that time, only 48 of Indiana's 92 counties had a public library, and there was apparently just one librarian in the state with a degree from a library school. The committee's lobbying efforts were successful, and the law, which provided for the establishment of traveling libraries and township libraries, passed in 1899. The Public Library Commission of Indiana was also established that year. Elizabeth served as president of the commission from 1916 to 1925. Her tireless work for the commission brought her national recognition and the vice presidency of the American Library Association in the 1920s. Other library activities included serving as president of the Indiana Library and Historical Department and League of Library Commissions, the Indiana Library Trustees Association, and the Indiana Library Commission. Another outlet for Elizabeth's activities was the Indiana Federation of Women's Club, which was part of the General Federation of Women's Clubs. The GFWC was formed in the 1890s to unite women's clubs to enhance community service by volunteers throughout the world. The organization still exists with about 80,000 members in more than a dozen countries. At the 1911 meeting at the Claypool Hotel in Indianapolis, Elizabeth spoke about the special interests of the group, which included child labor, pure food, a new building for the State Library and Museum, and extension of libraries to all townships. And just by the way, the Claypool Hotel was built by Elizabeth's uncle. Her family reached throughout the state. In 1915, Elizabeth traveled to Washington, D.C. as a representative of GFWC to meet with officials to discuss the role of government in child and women's welfare. During World War I, Elizabeth, as a representative of the American Library Association, became involved in the United War Work Drive. 7 non-governmental organizations held a week-long campaign in November 1918 with a goal of raising $170 million to aid American soldiers stationed in Europe. Ultimately, more than $200 million was raised. After the war ended, Elizabeth found another cause in the Roosevelt Memorial Organization, a drive to raise $5 million to erect a memorial to President Theodore Roosevelt. It was noted in a Muncie Morning Star article that the women of Indiana will have equal representation with the men in the Roosevelt Memorial Organization, which was nice since the women had just been involved in raising $200 million, or about $3.5 billion in today's money. Next slide, please. Because of her work lobbying for a variety of legislation and her involvement with the General Federation of Women's Clubs, it seemed natural that Elizabeth would become active in the suffrage movement and in the League of Women Voters. And while her legislative work may have influenced her, hearing a speech by Susan B. Anthony in the early 1900s truly inspired her. In 1919, she was again lobbying the Indiana State Legislature, this time as a representative of the Women's Franchise League of Indiana. During this time, Elizabeth worked out of an office in the Indiana State House. Along with the Legislative Council of Indiana, the Franchise League addressed a number of interests in addition to suffrage, including prohibition and legislative reform. She also spent time traveling the state, and in a speech to the Jasper Franchise League, Elizabeth said, "I am very optimistic over the suffrage situation in Indiana at this time, especially since our legislature has passed a resolution calling for early passage of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment by the United States Senate. When the amendment is finally passed, we will feel like our soldiers have been victorious." Well, of course, the soldiers were ultimately victorious, and Elizabeth could then focus on getting the newly franchised women to vote. As a district chair of the newly formed League of Women Voters, Elizabeth traveled the state from Rushville to Lafayette to South Bend and beyond to speak to women's groups and to help form local chapters. In Richmond, in September 1920, Elizabeth addressed a group of voters and explained the plan and purpose of the organization. She urged the women to affiliate with a political party, but noted that the new league was to be nonpartisan. So she said that women could vote more intelligently and gain support by men of both parties. And in true newspaper fashion, it was noted that the organizational meeting closed with refreshments and with several violin numbers played by Miss Ruth Scott. Several years later, Elizabeth, as chair of the Committee on International Cooperation to Prevent War, a committee of the League of Women Voters, spoke at a meeting of the Institute on International Affairs in Cincinnati. The session that she chaired was devoted to the questions of reparations and debt cancellation. In 1924, Elizabeth was appointed chairman of the Legislative Committee. She also served as a delegate of the League to the Conference on the Cause and Cure of War. Next slide, please. Elizabeth Claypool Earle spent most of her life working for the benefit of her community. In December 1931, she died after an illness of several months at her sister-in-law's home in Lafayette. Next slide, please. She was buried in a Lafayette cemetery beside her late husband, who she outlived by more than 50 years. There were tributes to her in newspapers throughout Indiana. It was noted in the Lafayette Journal that Elizabeth's keen and alert mentality, her inherent grace, poise, and quiet tact, combined with sound methods, an attractive personality, and extensive observation and experience, made her remarkably effective as the advocate of a cause. I'm glad that in my wanderings through looking for the history of the Historical Society that I met Elizabeth.
Thank you, Karen. If anyone has any questions, you can go ahead and place it in the chat. I was wondering why Elizabeth's sister, Virginia, was known as the Queen of American Agriculture.
Well, she's a really interesting person too, just amazingly accomplished. And after her husband's death, Virginia, age 33, became the sole owner and operator of the family farm, which was located near Cambridge City. She raised the livestock and spoke at the Farmers Institutes to audiences of men only on the subject of livestock management. She also wrote for and edited the Breeders' Gazette, a livestock journal, and she started the home economics department at the University of Minnesota and at Purdue University. And she was the first woman to work for Purdue University's agricultural extension department. And she did this, she adopted 2 children after her husband died. So she did all of this also while raising 2 children.
Well, I definitely think that would definitely make her the Queen of American Agriculture. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? As Melissa said in the chat, that's definitely boiler up. I would definitely agree with that. Okay, so it doesn't look like we have any questions. So we're going to go to our next presenter, who's Karen Brown. Good.
Thank you, Sarah. This evening, I'm going to be talking about Ida Husted Harper, and I have heard her maiden name pronounced Husted and also Husted. So tonight, I'm just going to use Husted because I don't really know which is correct, so bear with me on that. So Ida Husted Harper was born in Fairfield, Indiana, in 1851. She is the daughter of John A. and Cassandra Husted. When she was 10 years old, the family decided to move to Muncie so she could obtain educational advantages of a larger town. Ida was also a member of the first graduating class of Muncie Central Academy in 1868. Next slide. I have a 50-year reunion of that class. There were actually 7 young women. You'll notice that there's 8 there because Mrs. McRae is standing in the center. But if you look on the front row, and the person sitting down on the left is Ida Husted Harper. And like I said, this is the 50th reunion of their graduating class. But after graduation, Ida attended Indiana University for 1 year, and then she was accepted as a principal at a high school in Peru, Indiana. Then in December of 1871, she married Thomas Waymans Harper, and the couple moved to Terre Haute so that Thomas could practice law. Next slide, please. In 1872, Ida launched a career in journalism with the Saturday Evening Mail. She actually used a pen name of John Smith because she realized as a woman she would never be published. Later, she began submitting articles to other newspapers, including the Indianapolis News. She also contributed articles to the Fireman's Magazine. In 1874, her daughter Winifred was born, but Ida kept writing. Although always interested in equal rights for women, it wasn't until 1896 that I found her actively involved. For 8 months that year, she was chairman of the Indiana State Press Committee, where she was managing, organizing, writing, and feeling the public pulse by being in constant communication with 250 newspapers that supported the 19th Amendment. Then in 1897, she became the secretary of the Indiana Women's Suffrage Association. And in that position, she organized a 2-day convention in each of Indiana's congressional districts as a means of promoting the cause for women. Next slide, please. At the request of Susan B. Anthony, she moved to California to lobby for the passage of the state constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote. And she served as the movement's public relations secretary. The campaign in California failed, but she refused to accept the inequality of women in society, and she continued writing about women's rights, including the rights of women in marriage, womanhood, divorce, careers, and education. And after the failure of the California campaign, Susan B. Anthony asked Ida to become her official biographer. Ida agreed, and she moved into Susan's home in Rochester, New York, so that she could go through Mrs. Anthony's many documents and correspondence and letters that she had. Next slide, please. In 1898, she published The Life and Work of Susan B. Anthony, the official biography. And then later, she and Anthony published volume 4 titled The History of Women's Suffrage. However, although she was writing and doing all of these biographies and things, she never quit working for women's rights, especially their right to vote. The next few slides are some of the examples of some of the things that I found in newspapers. Next slide, please. This is a newspaper clipping from the Washington District of Columbia, Evening Star, dated February 11th, 1904. It was the opening session of the 36th Annual Women's Suffrage Meeting, in which Mrs. Ida Husted Harper presented the new declarations of principle. It basically said that our forefathers gained the right to vote in their victory against taxation without representation in the battle against King George of England. And our foremothers were okay with only men having the right of representation because no married woman was allowed to own property and all women were barred from money-making occupations. Therefore, they had no representation because they paid no taxes. But the women in the United States now pay taxes on real and personal estate valued at billions of dollars. So women demand that the immortal principles established by the War of the Revolution shall be applied equally to women and men. In other words, they wanted to have representation on their taxation. Next slide. I found this article in October 1st, 1909, Women's Exponent, where it announced that Ida Husted Harper would edit Progress, beginning with the January issue. And also notice in the last sentence, it says that the press department was under the personal direction of Mrs. Ida Husted Harper. Her persuasive articles appeared in newspapers nationwide, and these essays for women's suffrage helped change newspaper support of the cause. The newspapers were a critical part of changing Americans' opinions about supporting women winning the ballot. Her charge of the Leslie Bureau of Suffrage Education in Washington, D.C. is credited with helping to influence the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Next slide, please. This I thought was a very unusual statement in which I found this in the Muncie Evening Press, and it was September the 21st, 1910. It reported that Ida Husted Harper said that men were to blame for the, quote, empty cradle, unquote. She said, it is time to call a halt on the constant blaming of women for race suicide. She went on to say, fully 50% of childless marriages are due to the determination of husbands not to have their pleasures interfered with, and a large percent is due to the sterility of husbands because of the excesses before and after marriage. Every man and woman knows the vast majority of wives long for children and are willing to risk comfort, health, and life itself. The love of the average father bears a very small ratio of the length of the average mother. Next slide. And I love this. I think it showed a little bit of her humor on this in this article here. It says, oh, when you come to arguments against women's movement, said Mrs. Harper, you find some curious specimen. For instance, the other day, an old man got up at a meeting and said women should not vote because they could not fight. And after the meeting, I saw the old voter being helped down from the platform and into a cab by 2 women. Next slide, please. This is a photo that was March of 1913. It's the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration in Washington, D.C. It was the National American Women Association when they organized a suffrage parade down Pennsylvania Avenue. Over 5,000 women marched for suffrage. Afterwards, the suffrage leaders prepared for the next phase of their campaign. They wasted no time meeting with President Wilson just 2 weeks after he was sworn into office. 5 women gave the president a variety of reasons to back the cause, and Ida Husted Harper was one of those 5 women. Next slide. During the meeting with the president, Ida referenced Wilson's 1912 campaign promise of the new freedom, reasoning that a perfect new freedom cannot come until women as well as men are given the right to vote. She also told the president that she did not want to live in a country where a bunch of smug experts sit down behind closed doors in Washington and play Providence to her. However, at that meeting, the president declined to comment. He informed the women that the purpose of his domestic policies would be tariff, banking, business reforms. Fortunately, President Wilson finally came on board the amendment and it was passed. Next slide. Melissa actually gave this to me or sent it to me, and I thought this was really cool. I had not realized that this is the signing of the amendment, the 19th Amendment. It's the House and Senate leaders, and Speaker Gillette is signing the resolution, getting it ready to go to the states. And if you look at the last person on the left is Ida Houston Harper. August 18th of 1920, Tennessee approved the 19th Amendment. This provided for the final ratification necessary to add the amendment to the Constitution. And just a side note, Ida Houston Harper was one of a very few of the early suffragists that were still living at the time of its passing. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. That was really amazing. One of the things I was wondering is that since she was still living when it was passed, but did she actually get to vote in November of that year of 1920?
Yes, she was still alive at that time. She was actually living at the American Association of University of Women at the time of her death in 1931. So that means that she got to vote that year. She also got to vote in the 1920 presidential election, in which Woodrow Wilson was reelected. And then she would have also got to vote in 1924 and 1928.
Well, that's wonderful. Does anyone else have any other questions? We did have one come into the chat, but Melissa did answer it, but I'll go ahead and just throw it out there to everybody. Was Houston funded? How was she funded? Did she come from a family of wealth, or did her journalism cover her travel expenses? Melissa answered that Susan B. Anthony hired her to work for the National Suffrage Organization.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa.
Are there any other questions?
And I just want to say the stuff that I said tonight just barely touches her life. She was very involved and just into so many different things, doing so many different things for the cause.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move on to our next presenter, who is Jessica Jenkins.
Great, thank you, Sara. Well, I wanted to say kind of on the front here that I'm very honored to be speaking here tonight alongside such knowledgeable women, and definitely very excited to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, women's suffrage. And I'm sure for all of you, it will come as no surprise that as an employee at Minnetrista, I'm going to talk to you a little bit tonight, just very briefly, about the Ball family and their involvement with the suffrage movement here in Muncie. So really through a lot of years of doing suffrage research and talking with a lot of people about the history of women's voting rights, I've really found that popular culture has really created an image in a lot of people's minds about what a suffragist is. So I always like to share a certain image when I get started, because this is the woman that a lot of people think of. Sara, if you could click to the next slide. That's her, Mrs. Winifred Banks, that really lovable mother from Mary Poppins, who is there belting out Sister Suffragette at number 17 Cherry Tree Lane with her maids. And while Winifred Banks is, of course, a very memorable fictional character, at Minnetrista, where we document the lives and experiences of the Ball family, our suffragists look a little bit more realistic and recognizable in Muncie's history. Next slide. So after, sifting through the historic record, I'm very excited to say that several members of the Ball family were themselves suffragists and identified as suffragists, including Emma Wood Ball, Bertha Crosley Ball, Bessie Brady Ball, and Sarah Rogers Ball and her daughter Helen. And Sara, if you could give me that next slide, kind of last but not least is Dr. Lucius L. Ball. Yes, the good doctor there was not only a supporter of women's voting rights, but he was a paying member of one of Muncie's local suffrage organizations himself. And I really love being able to point out that Lucius was a member, because often we tend to think of suffragists solely as women, but in reality, many men who supported women's voting rights also identified as suffragists themselves. So from the time that The Muncie Equal Franchise League, which is the group that I'm going to kind of focus on here, formed in 1912. The Ball family was really actively involved in advocating for women's voting rights. And as active members of the league, Sara, Emma, Bessie, and Bertha really took on a lot of active roles in that group, and they were at the biweekly meetings that the group had, they were at the events that they held, and they found lots of ways to get involved, including Emma and Bessie and Bertha all serving on that organization's board of directors and taking on a variety of different leadership roles. Sara and Bessie represented Muncie's organization up at the state suffrage level at state suffrage conventions, and Bessie even for a time served on the board of the state level suffrage league as well. Sara, if you could go to the next slide. So while the Muncie Equal Franchise League hosted their regular meetings at a variety of locations that we're going to hear a little bit more about later, the hosting of meetings and gatherings in the homes of members' houses was an activity that happened kind of more regularly early on and less later on, but it was this regular activity that they did. And this was actually pretty typical around the country, no matter what town or state you were in. Having members host the rest of the group at their house was a thing that they often did. And really embracing that idea, in November of 1913, the group met at Maplewood, the home of Emma and William C. Ball. And the couple's son, William H., seen on the screen here, really began that meeting with the performance of several vocal numbers, some of which were suffrage themed. So songs about women's voting rights. After William kind of broke the ice for the meeting, then the group really undertook their business meeting, and that was followed by a presentation on how women's suffrage could really have a positive effect on the evils of liquor. And as that mention of the evils of liquor really suggests, Muncie's activists did not only work for suffrage, but they also lobbied for broader social reforms as well. So the Balls, like other members of the Franchise League, were really interested in other social advances, including better child labor laws, liquor reform, education reform, and improvements to the juvenile court system. And Muncie suffragists really made sure that all of those topics were brought to the public's attention. And they really worked to educate residents of Muncie on these varied topics through public presentations and also by placing publications tackling those topics at places like the public library and the courthouse. If you could go on to the next slide, Sara. So while Emma's 1913 suffrage meeting at Maplewood was certainly noteworthy, she was not the only member of the Ball family to open up their home in the name of suffrage. So throughout the 19-teens, not only did Emma sporadically host suffrage meetings at Maplewood, but her sisters-in-law along Minnetrista Boulevard also opened up their homes for several suffrage meetings as well. And what's interesting to know is when they hosted these meetings, this was open to the full membership of the Franchise League. And that membership, while of course was heavily made up of members of very prominent families in Muncie, it was also made up of women, men from a wide variety of backgrounds in town. So this really was a mixed and diverse group. Another example of a thing that happened on the boulevard is that in 1918, Bessie and Frank Ball hosted a garden party for local suffragists at their home, Minnetrista. But what I want to flip to here is an event that happened on the evening of June 14th, 1918. And that was a Franchise League event that was hosted at the home of Bertha Crosley Ball and Edmund B. Ball at their home Nevasham that's up here on the screen. And this event was a reception for nationally known suffragist Ida Houston Harper, who Karen told us, a really interesting brief history about. As you heard from Karen, she was a native Hoosier. She had connections to Muncie. So it made a lot of sense that they would host her at their home. But during the course of the evening, Harper gave a talk to everyone that was in attendance regarding the Leslie Suffrage Commission that Karen mentioned just a few minutes ago. And that suffrage organization was based in New York, And they really worked very aggressively to educate the public about women's voting rights, particularly through the Press Bureau, set up to provide suffrage materials to newspapers and publications around the country. And as the editorial correspondent for that bureau, Harper really was able to give Muncie suffragists kind of an insider's view of that organization's work. So it really was quite a treat for our local suffragists here. So Sara, if you could go on to the next slide. Just 1 month later, on July 4th, the couple again opened up their home in Nevesham to Muncie suffragists. And this time, the occasion was a visit to Muncie by Jeanette Rankin. And Miss Rankin was not only a noted national suffragist, but she was also the first female representative to be elected to the nation's Congress from the state of Montana. So, planning to arrive in Muncie by 11:15 a.m., give or take a little, if the trains were running on time. Miss Rankin then would, the plan was that she would proceed over to Nevesham, and there she was entertained at a luncheon with local suffragists right before giving a public speech over at the fairgrounds, just across the street from the Ball's property. So the proximity worked out well, plus they had the space to host a large gathering, and it really was an event that people very much enjoyed. Miss Rankin is noted for being, she was quite the speaker. she made great public appearances. So she was certainly someone that was interesting, and again, kind of that extra treat to be able to see at the local level. And Sara, if you could just move to my last slide. So just 11 months after Bertha and Edmund Ball hosted Representative Rankin at their home, the United States Congress passed the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And that legislation really extended the opportunity to vote to women around the nation. Before the law could go into effect, however, 36 states needed to ratify or approve that measure. So in Indiana, suffragists got to work. And the state level Franchise League pulled out all of the stops and began a campaign to really encourage Indiana's governor to call a special session of the legislature to vote on the amendment. And what's really interesting is they kind of started spending money that they didn't have in the bank. To do this, they had to lobby lawmakers. They were printing additional pamphlets and flyers. They were running newspaper articles, all things that cost money. And then finally, after being delivered with about 86,000 petitions and hearing kind of from a never-ending string of supporters, the governor called that special session into order. And, having laid out all those things that they were spending cash on, it wasn't cheap. So in order to cover those costs that the state suffrage organization had spent money on, what they did is they put a call out to each county asking to pledge hundreds of dollars to cover those costs from each county. So in Delaware County, suffragists were expected to come up with $400 as what they were footing into the bill. And always coming through in a pinch, the women of the Ball family, looked to resources that they may have that not everyone else did. And women from the Ball family covered about half of Delaware County's cost out of their own pockets. So on January 16th, 1920, the fateful day, as I like to think of it, arrived. And after debates on both sides, Indiana's lawmakers voted in favor of ratifying the 19th Amendment. And within 7 months, the remaining states had approved that measure as well. So, this fight for women's voting rights had been really long and really hard, some places longer than in others, but suffragists around the nation had really persisted nonetheless. And in Muncie, suffragists, including the Ball family, really proved that in order to create change, the work of all women and connecting to all people really was necessary to push that change and, have it ring true for everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. That's actually a really good ending too, just to remember what Linda Hansen had said in her statement about democracy for all of us and that it works for all of us. So thank you for that. I was wondering about the names. So in our last presentation, when you had talked about the Columbia Theater and the film, you'd used the term Equal Franchise League, and some other people have used Women's Franchise League. Were they the same thing, or were they different organizations?
No, they're the same thing. And it's really interesting. If you look at the organizational minutes, if you look at newspaper articles, even how the suffragists were referring to themselves, they kind of bounce back and forth. And that was actually something pretty typical in a lot of communities around Indiana, around the whole state, was this kind of interchangeable language around the suffrage movement. It's the same thing with the term franchise being interchangeable with suffrage, and it really showing up in a variety of ways. So definitely still the same organization, just language that felt a little bit different, that they felt good about using one time and one another.
Okay, well, thank you. If there are any questions, go ahead and place them into the chat. Also, if you're able to take a look at the chat, there's a lot of sidebar discussions going on that are kind of fun. So please take a look at that. And we're gonna go ahead. I don't see any questions. So we're gonna go ahead on to our next presenter, Sara McKinley.
Thank you, Sara. My talk this evening, if you'd like to go to the next slide, will be about the Women's Franchise League of Muncie, with a particular focus on their work during their first year. I learned from Melissa Gentry that the league actually held a lot of their first meetings at the Carnegie Library, so naturally that was of particular interest to me as a researcher. The story actually begins when the Women's Franchise League of Indiana suffrage group was organized in 1911 to press for passage of the 19th Federal Amendment to the Constitution. On the 9th of June, 1912, the Muncie newspapers reported that there was a preliminary organization for a permanent chapter of the Women's Franchise League in Muncie. The Muncie chapter was officially established that summer and began meeting at the YWCA, the Carnegie Library, local churches, and as we learned from Jessica, they also met at the homes of its members, many of whom were the wives of prominent Muncie citizens. The assembly room of the public library seemed to be one of the group's primary meeting locations during their first year, which likely helped the group gather membership, as it would be a free public space in the heart of downtown Muncie. Next slide, please. For those who may or may not be familiar with the Carnegie Library, the room that they met in is on the basement level in the northwest corner of the building facing Jackson and Jefferson Streets. So looking at these two photos, the room that they met in was in the lower level of the corner behind where the traffic light and the Muncie Public Library sign are currently located. And that room is now a research room. Next slide. The Women's Franchise League of Muncie was a lively group led by their president, Susan Ryan Marsh, the wife of John Rowland Marsh. As Jessica mentioned, although the group's primary goal was to secure the right for women to vote, they used their platform to also tackle various causes for the betterment of the community. Their earliest causes included better salaries for teachers and waging a war on cigarettes. On 18th of November, 1912, the Franchise League met at the public library to discuss, quote, the evils of cigarettes, which were quoted as containing more poison than a gallon of whiskey. Their guest speakers were Dr. George R. Green, who spoke on the effect of nicotine on the system, and Mr. Hensey on the cigarette laws of Indiana. Mrs. Marsh presided over the meeting and urged all women and men of the city to attend. The program also discussed the use of tobacco by minors. Next slide. On the 7th of January, 1913, it was reported that the women laid plans for broadening the scope of their work and heard excellent addresses on vital subjects at an enthusiastic meeting of the Franchise League. The Muncie newspaper reported, quote, a more active campaign than ever before is to be waged by the members of the Women's Franchise League in their efforts toward the education of women for the ballot, and a number of leaders who are interested in the work in this city have been appointed to carry on the advancement. The first meeting of 1913 had one of the largest audiences ever attending a meeting of the League. Mrs. Daisy Barr, who later became one of Muncie's more notorious historical figures, was a pastor of the Friends Memorial Church at the time and gave a talk about the history of women's suffrage in the United States and in Scandinavian countries. She led the talk from personal observations of the cause of women in both countries. It was also during this meeting that Martha Ivins, Harriet McClellan, and Sarah Crossfield formulated the Constitution and bylaws of the Franchise League's Muncie chapter. Next slide. By this time, the League had gained some momentum. The Muncie League was receiving publicity on women's suffrage from the state headquarters, such as a paper titled, "Do Men Represent Women?" by Anne O'Hagan. The paper argued that no class ever in the history of the world has legislated justly and equally for any other class, and that man legislating as a class for woman as a class was no exception to this universal rule. The paper cited some examples. It took 150 years for men to recognize that the word youth included girls as well as boys, and that the free school system of the US might widely be used by girls as well. It took even longer for the beginnings of the concept of equal pay for equal work. It had only recently been recognized that a woman's property was at all her own. Less than 20 years earlier, in 1894, it was perfectly acceptable when a sheriff waited outside a church in Kentucky for a marriage ceremony to conclude so that he could immediately seize the bride's property, which happened to be her coach and her horses, to pay off the debt of her groom. The paper goes on to conclude that men legislating as a class for women as a class has done exactly what every ruling class has always done throughout the history of the world. They have discriminated against the class which had no legal voice. The paper explained that this is the condition that democracy aims to correct, and this was why women were fighting for the right to vote, to have a legal voice. Next slide. Oh, sorry, go back. Later that same month, Mrs. Felix T. McWhirter, president of the Indiana Federation of Clubs and member of the State Franchise League of Indiana, was the guest speaker at the Muncie League's meeting at the public library. Her talk was themed around being a mother, and that equal suffrage was necessary for mothers because while they have the important task of raising the children, once children leave the home, mothers have no part in the building of schools, in selecting the curriculum or the teachers, in making the town, or in having a say in the use of the taxes that they pay. So how can they truly fulfill that vital role? Mrs. Marsh, president of the League, concluded the meeting by stating the 3 reasons why equal suffrage was most seriously needed. Number 1, mothers must be good patriotic citizens, and to do this and to teach it to their children, they must know and become conversant with it. Number 2, to help the teachers, and number 3, to help the men themselves. The League reported it had 168 paying members at the time of the meeting, both men and women, and more joined the League after Mrs. McWhirter's speech. Now, next slide. The next month, one of the guest speakers at the meeting at the library was Muncie local Mrs. Odessa Rail. Mrs. Rail was a prominent worker with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and her talk was titled, "The Reason Why." After a speech about morality and alcohol, she stated that, quote, "The woman in the home is responsible for its cleanliness and health and for the morals of the home. Men elect the city officials, and they are usually chosen from a political standpoint. How can she control the morals when she has no voice in the lawmaking? Men are responsible for the conditions under which children live, but women are the ones held responsible for the result of those conditions." 1 week later, Yorktown established their own Women's Franchise League. On March 3rd, 1913, Muncie's Franchise League met again at the public library. The Muncie suffragettes discussed how they didn't approve of the forceful demonstrations of the suffragettes in England, but admired them for the progress they had made. Local school teacher Miss Harriet McClellan outlined the work of English suffragettes that she had observed while studying in England, and explained that on any given day, the suffragettes would assemble in parks and use a box or anything they could find to serve as a platform for giving speeches from. Mrs. Mary Case gave an address titled "The Progress of Women in Business," and said that women have been conquering the industrial world in America and would soon be assured financial independence. Women now held jobs in all but 9 of the 303 fields of work. Next slide. On March 23rd, 1913, Mrs. Carl Bilby reported that 3 women's franchise leagues had now formed in Delaware County, and noted special enthusiasm on the part of the men. It was stated that Mrs. Marsh had received many invitations from men for her to come and address their meetings, showing that, quote, "Men are more interested in women voting than the women think they are." When the women met for their bi-monthly meeting at the library on April 14th, 1913 to discuss state laws, one such man who participated in the meeting was guest speaker Fred McClellan, a well-known Muncie attorney and the former city attorney who discussed the movement of women for the ballot from a legal standpoint. A few years later, the number of franchise leagues in Delaware County grew again as the African-American community in Muncie started the Booker T. Washington Franchise League. This league was established on the 21st of May, 1917, after a meeting of the Colored Women's Christian Temperance Union, at which members of the Women's Franchise League were actually guest speakers. Mrs. Odessa Rail gave a talk on health and heredity, and Mrs. Barrett, who was president of the Women's Franchise League that year, gave a talk on citizenship for women. The Booker T. Washington Franchise League of Muncie usually met thereafter at the Bethel AME Church or the Union Baptist Church. And last slide, please. The Women's Franchise League of Muncie's meeting minutes can be found at Ball State Archives and are available to read in the Ball State Digital Media Repository. An article published in the Muncie Star in 1980, written by Rose Marie Higgins, talked about reading through this collection of meeting minutes in Ball State Stoeckel archives. According to the minutes from October 1913, the League had a committee responsible for distributing literature about the League, and they made sure to distribute papers at public places such as the YWCA and the public library. After 1913, it appears that the meetings were mostly held at local churches and League members' houses rather than at the public library or the YWCA, but Muncie's women and men continued to fight for women's suffrage and other topics that women felt strongly about, including education, child labor and minimum wage laws, the effects of excessive drinking on families, the public health concerns such as impurities found in Muncie's drinking water, and sanitation in the dairy industry. For 7 anxious years, these women felt empowered to finally have their voices heard, and in 1920, many women, though not all women, finally solidified the ability to have their voices heard at the ballot box. When the 19th Amendment was passed, the Women's Franchise League of Muncie felt its purpose was accomplished. In the League's final meeting conducted by Mrs. A.F. Meeks in 1920, she reported, quote, "Be it resolved that the Muncie branch of the Women's Franchise League, known as the Women's Franchise League of Muncie, is now dissolved through the action of the state organization, and its goodwill be transferred to the new League of Women Voters of Muncie." Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a really nice kind of introduction into how and where they first met, the Women's Franchise League. So I was wondering, being a librarian myself, were any of the librarians at the library a part of the Women's Franchise League, or were they listed in the membership rolls?
So looking through the meeting minutes and the membership rolls, we were unable to find any of the librarians' names. But I know that a lot of those women did support the work of the suffrage movement. So it's kind of interesting that they weren't listed as members, but I know a lot of them were actively involved. Club women, Muncie's first librarian, Hattie Patterson, actually was one of the founding members of the Muncie Women's Club. So I imagine that they supported the movement, but they apparently were not officially members.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Does anyone have any questions for Sarah? Okay, so we're gonna move on to our last presenter for the evening, Melissa Gentry.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Sarah. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So tonight, I will be identifying some of the places related to suffrage around the city. And some of these faces have already been mentioned tonight, and sadly, many of the places have been demolished. For example, Ida Husted Harper's family home is now a parking lot. But I think the last so-called suffrage spot that I have might surprise you. Next slide. So the first suffrage spot is the old Muncie High School on High Street between Charles and Adams, where the Ivy Tech Fisher Building is today. It was the home to many suffragist teachers and students. At the March 1913 meeting of the Franchise League, a courageous suffragist hero emerged from the minutes, as Sarah mentioned, Harriet McClellan, and she was a teacher at the high school. Next slide. Harriet protested with Emmeline Pankhurst and the more militant suffragettes in London. The experience was an epiphany for her, and she became dedicated to the cause here at home. The League listened as she discussed their tactics and agreed to support their British sisters, but were too reserved to consider that type of protest themselves. Next slide. The women were impressed when Susan Ryan Marsh and Emma Jean Taft-Lesh attended a march on the Indiana State House the same day as that DC suffrage parade that Karen mentioned. At the State House, women quietly attempted to pin "Votes for Women" buttons on the legislators. That kind of protest was more their style. In 1914, Muncie celebrated with the rest of the leagues in the country on the very first suffrage day in McCulloch Park. Harriet McClellan delivered a rousing speech for the cause. She made the argument that the voting would not take away much of the woman's time from home. Quote, even if she only voted once a year, she would have 364 days to attend to her home, unquote. Next slide. At the January 1914 Franchise League meeting, Harriet participated in a staged debate. Other debaters arguing the pros and cons of women voting were a prominent attorney and Emma Jean's husband, Lincoln Lesh, some college students, and June Jones. June Jones was a librarian at the high school who also considered herself an ardent suffragist. She's seen here on the newly formed athletic board at the high school in 1920. As the only woman, June was immediately elected to be the recording secretary. Numerous other teachers of all grades in Muncie can be found listed in the Franchise League minutes. Next slide. The next suffrage spot is McNaughton's department store, the massive 5-story building that would later house Ball's store on the corner of Walnut and Charles. And now it's that Raymond James, that glass building. The president of McNaughton's, Carl O'Hara, and his wife, Florence McNaughton O'Hara, supported numerous causes for women and used their newspaper advertising to keep Muncie women informed. Next slide. The National Franchise League sponsored melting pot days in the spring of 1915, where local groups collected chains, rings, earrings, pins, watches, souvenir spoons in a pot on display in stores and clubs. The trinkets were collected at the state headquarters and exchanged for cash. Next slide. Muncie native Frances Wilson Grayson, the niece of President Wilson and an entertainer and future aviator, performed for a spellbound audience at the Melting Pot kickoff celebration on May 1st. Next slide. The Melting Pot was displayed in the front windows of McNaughton's through June of 1915. Customers were encouraged to contribute. All the melting pots were donated on June 1st at a celebration in Indianapolis. Evansville and the North Boulevard branch in Indianapolis had the biggest contributions. Next slide. In 1917, McNaughton's again took center stage in the battle for the ballot. The Indiana legislature passed a partial suffrage bill that would allow women to vote that fall. The State League proposed that from June 22nd through August 23rd, every league in the state opened headquarters where notaries would register women. One of those headquarters was McNaughton's. Elected Chase Murphy became a notary public specifically to register women to vote. She set up a table at McNaughton's, first near the underwear section, then the shoe department, and registered women for free, and registered men for a quarter. The store heavily advertised the voting registration drive that summer. Next slide. The Black churches of Muncie, especially Calvary Baptist and Bethel AME, also became important suffrage spots that summer. The African American Booker T. Washington Franchise League was organized, and they helped mobilize a citywide voter registration drive. When their officers hosted a meeting in the Whiteley neighborhood, women and men there founded another franchise league. Next slide. Josephine Pearson was a leader at the Calvary Baptist Church and was elected vice president of the Booker T. Washington League. Next slide. She and her daughters, Nettie, Ruth, and Ada, were examples of these African American suffragists in Muncie. Mothers, wives, sisters, active in church charities, and volunteering at the YWCA and the Red Cross. Next slide. Mary Keith and her daughters, Ruth and Ella, were dedicated suffragists and organized along with women of the Bethel AME Church. Ruth was a student when she was elected the first corresponding secretary of that Booker T. Washington League in 1917. Next slide. That summer of 1917, the 4 leagues of Muncie and the 5 other leagues in the county coordinated their efforts. They hosted picnics and conducted workshops at churches and parks. They used cars to drive around the county registering women, and membership numbers ballooned. The summer of suffrage was all for naught, though, when the Supreme Court declared the law unconstitutional that fall. No records could be found related to the Booker T. Washington League after that August of 1917, but you can be sure that this group of active community organizers did their best to get out the vote, because the Pearsons and the Keiths, along with the women of the Black churches, were some of the leading organizers of fundraisers during World War I. They were leaders. And in other cities around the country, it was the Black churches that produced the suffrage leaders and the voters, not necessarily exclusive suffrage clubs or franchise leagues. Next slide. The next spot related to suffrage is the Commercial Club, which is still standing. This is the first place that's still standing. The Franchise League conducted events and distributed pamphlets in the building over the years. In March of 1920, the rooms of the Commercial Club were the site of a so-called voter or citizenship schools for women. Next slide. Women were taught about casting a vote and basic civic lessons. Imogene Lesh addressed the opening session, and Julia Nelson was the chair. The first morning session was attended by about 50 women, but each successive session in the afternoon and evening were packed with, quote, interested and enthusiastic women eager to be well prepared to cast their vote, unquote. Men also attended just to watch, and in some cases, meet the women. Next slide. Garnet Warfel, a supposedly progressive and independent reporter in Muncie, published this story about attending the suffrage school. At first, she was trying to impress her male co-workers by not going, thinking that suffragists were in fact objectionable to the men. But those men glared at her and called her old-fashioned. Unfortunately, it was their peer pressure that forced her to attend the school. But she was evangelized successfully for life and wrote that she couldn't wait for Election Day. Around the same time, McNaughton's hosted demonstrations on how to vote and displayed a voting machine for women to view that spring and summer. Next slide. When Election Day arrived on November 2nd, one newspaper reported that the most important woman was Mother Nature. It was brutally cold and windy that day, but women showed up in large numbers. In Muncie, babies seemed to be the chief concern of many of the women that were compelled to stand often for an hour or more in line in the raw, cold air waiting to vote. Which brings us to our somewhat surprising suffrage spot. Next slide. One woman, quote, checked in, unquote, her infant at the Bodkins Veterinary Hospital next to her polling station. And this would be right across from the AT&T building today. Reportedly, her baby was the center of an admiring group of women who worked at the veterinary clinic, each anxious to help care for it. Word got around, so the vet's office served as a quasi-daycare on Election Day. Sometimes neighbors watched each other's children while one mother would go and vote. And in one report, a husband even held his baby while his wife voted. Next slide. Election officials worried that women would have trouble voting, but the incidents on Election Day were anticlimactic. Women knew how to vote and how to conduct themselves at the polls. And thanks to the League of Women Voters, we still do.
Thank you, Melissa. That was really great to see all the different places, even though some of them aren't standing anymore. But to see the different places that the suffrage movement used to move towards the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So I was wondering, you had talked about the Indiana suffragists who flocked to the State House in protest and penned votes for women's buttons on legislatures. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think that that's kind of fun.
So it's kind of interesting because the suffrage parade in 1913 that Karen mentioned, there were only 10 Indiana women who participated that we know of in that parade, but there were 500 women on that same day that paraded to the Indiana State House for that protest. So I was a little disheartened when I was doing suffrage history and I learned that there were only 10 women in the suffrage parade from Indiana. But then it made me feel better knowing that there were 500 of them doing their own kind of parade at the State House. So it was just kind of, they called it a silent protest, where they tried to get the legislators just to pin votes for women on their lapels, and a lot of them wouldn't even allow that. So that just tells you the state in 1913 in Indiana.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Melissa or for any of our other presenters this evening? I'll give some time if people want to put into the chat. I did notice when I was going through the chat that someone made a comment that Dr. Beverly Pitts was actually acting president at Ball State prior to Dr. Goya. So that is a little correction in my opening statements. So I'm just gonna wait. A lot of people are just saying thank you and how wonderful the presentation was. It doesn't look like we have any other questions. But so before we end this evening, I just want to highlight some other women's history events and projects that have been going on in Muncie, Delaware County. The Muncie Public Library created a very nice video about 5 notable women of Muncie and Delaware County. And also Archives and Special Collections at Ball State University has a digital exhibit about the Women's Franchise League that includes images from the collection and talks about the league's work towards the partial suffrage bill in 1917 that had been discussed through the majority of our talk this evening. The links for both the video and exhibit are on your screen, but will be shared in the chat and will also be in a follow-up email regarding this evening's presentation. Additionally, these links to the video and exhibit are in the biography of the Muncie Notables Instagram account, and links to our other previous programs are there as well in case you are interested. Also, we have another notable presentation, Mothers and Daughters, on April 13th at 6:30 p.m. More information is on the Delaware County Historical Society's Facebook page. So on behalf of our presenters this evening, we would like to thank you for joining us, and thank you to the Muncie Delaware County League of Women Voters. We have placed also in the chat a link to a survey, so if you could please take a couple minutes to fill it out, that would be great. It helps us think about some of our next presentations that we might be doing. We are planning on doing a presentation sometime in May or June, so keep an eye out for that. And again, we would like to thank you for joining us this evening.